Our next speaker is someone that I've known for a few years and currently serves as the Executive Vice President and Dean at Brite Divinity School, as well as the Professor of Pastoral Theology and Pastoral Care. Dr. Joretta Marshall is going to talk to us about forgiving communities.
I am delighted to be here and glad to see persons invested and interested in the work of finding ways to continue to bring healing and hope and restoration of souls. As a part of Brite Divinity School, this is the kind of project that we think is important. Brite has a kind of tagline, if you will, integrating, transforming scholarship, justice, and practice. And the Soul Repair Center is an illustration of how it is that we bring together scholarship, justice, and practice to transform the world. And at the same time, conversations we have around the rooms transform us. I think the conversations that we just overheard, the kind of sacred space of hearing the stories, transform not just the way we think, but the way that we do what we do and the way we think about how it is that we do what we do. So on behalf of Brite, it's a privilege to be here, and I appreciate your presence in this place. I realize that it has been a long day, and I want to give a shout out to T.J. York. Where is he? One of the associate pastors here in the church. T.J. drives from Midland to Brite Divinity School once a week, right? Coming in on Thursday because he has to take a class on Thursday night with me. And Friday morning he takes a class. And the class that he's taking is a course called Congregational Leadership, which in part is a course in which we try to think about what does it mean to be a leader in a community of faith? And what does it mean for the church or the community of faith to be a leader in a community? And it's this latter part, what does it mean for the church to be leaders in the community, that I want to just reflect with you a little bit about this afternoon. And instead of lecturing, I'm going to invite us into some conversation and dialogue, because you've listened to a lot of things, you have lots of experiences. I think Bill was the one who said there's lots of wisdom in the room. And what I want us to think together about, collaboratively if you will, is what does it mean to be the church or a community of faith that leads in the midst of the community? Why do we do that? And how is it that as communities of faith we can both seek forgiveness when we have failed, disappointed, disrupted in ways that have not been helpful for particularly families and veterans who are returning? And how can we be communities of faith that expand the kind of grace that is available so that all families, all communities, all persons who are part of our community begin not only to think about grace, but to experience it in the very ground of our being? So we're going to think about these things just a little bit together. I want to start with a question, and I have, of course, some answers to this question, and I'll give mine first, but as I go through them, I want you to think about how you would answer this question. The first question, it seems to me, is why should the church, or the community of faith, or the synagogue, or the mosque be invested in conversations and care for returning veterans and their families? Now, at one level, that seems like a fairly simple answered question. We do it because we care. But why do we care? And how does that care, particularly as a community of faith, compel us toward a particular way of being? I happen to be United Methodist. Any other United Methodists here? Bless your hearts. Who else do we have here? Disciples, raise your hand. Disciples? Baptist. Episcopalian, Roman Catholic, UCC. What am I missing? Lutheran. Presbyterian. How could I forget? Jewish. Christian Jew. Any others? The sun's in my eye here. Quaker, thank you. We are a diverse community, particularly, it sounds like, mostly of the kind of Protestant mainline, fringe mainline denominations. So I'm going to say a few things, and I'm going to share my theological reasons about why I think the community of faith needs to be invested in soul repair. And then I want to invite you to tell me a little bit more about what you bring to that conversation. Why are you sitting in this room as a person of faith who's part of a community of faith? It's one thing to be involved as an individual because we understand and we know and we care about people who are next to us, people who are neighbors, people who are family members. It's another to care because we are the church. I'm going to give 3 reasons why I think this work is important in communities of faith. First of all, I believe in the incarnation. And I believe in it so much that I think that the incarnation isn't something that happened just way back when, but it happens right now, right here, as we who are persons of faith become part of the body of Christ in a world. Many years ago, I was doing an event, and at the end of the event, it was a group of parents and youth leaders. Some of you have survived teenagers, as children, I mean. Yes. And one of the parents in this group was really concerned because she was trying to raise 3 teenage boys, and there just weren't enough answers. And as we gathered for prayer, I invited people to pray for their families, their youth leaders, their churches. This mother shared this prayer, and it's continued to live in me, and I think it is the prayer of the incarnational Christ. May the knowledge of the grace and love of God sink from my head down into my heart, so that it flows out of my hands and my mouth and my ears and my eyes, so that this body might be the body of Christ in the world. That's the incarnational prayer. That we are called to be the presence of a living God who very much cares about the pains and the hurts and the woundedness, visible and invisible, about the brokenness and about the wholeness and the holiness and the restorative nature of God's love. So my first reason for a church community to be engaged in this conversation is because we are the body of a living God who cares so much that there is a church to do the work of God. Second, I think churches, as several speakers have said last night and this morning, this afternoon, churches know something about the soul. We know something about what it means to love into the depths of God's love. We know something about what it means to care so much about this living God, or to be so distant from this living God that it grieves us. And part of what I think church communities bring to this conversation is a deep understanding for the kind of soul work that I think Dr. Brock has pointed to in her vision for soul repair. That this is the kind of work that churches, communities of faith, synagogues, mosques know something about. And tapping into that piece of our tradition, whatever that tradition is, however it shows up in your ecclesial family, tapping into that soul work becomes part of the gift that we offer to the world around us. And I think we can do nothing less than really wrestle with what it means to care for one another's souls, even as God cares for ours. And finally, did I say I was United Methodist? Yes. John Wesley is a person that I would not like to go to lunch with, but I really like his theology. He was a little rigid for my way of being, but in his time, he was out on the edge. His development of the notions of grace, particularly prevenient grace, continues to actually ground me as I think about the work of the Soul Repair Center. The prevenient understanding of prevenient grace is it's the grace that is there before you even know you need the grace. It's the grace that meets you in the morning and helps you get up in the morning and greets you in the day before you even know to call on it. It's the grace that claims you as a child before you even know to say the name of God, however it is that you say it. It's the grace that surrounds us and envelops us, and it's a grace that we cannot buy, we cannot trade. It is just the grace of our being in the being of God. So the third reason why I think the work of the Soul Repair Center is the work of churches and congregations is because it is part of the living into of God's prevenient grace. It is part of trusting that God's grace is there regardless, in spite of, because of all of the things that we've done, all of the people that we've become. It is the grace that puts us there before we even know it. So as part of a community of faith, part of a church, part of an ecclesial system, what I hope we do is that we live into that grace, trusting it will be there even when we don't know exactly what to do next to care for someone. Trusting that there are resources around us, trusting that there's wisdom in a room, and that we ourselves don't have to have all of the answers or know exactly the right thing to say. Trusting that listening and the courage it takes to listen is part of extending the grace of God. So now I'm curious, what brings you into this room as a person of faith or as part of a church? Just say it out loud, and I'll try to catch it and repeat it back so that everybody can hear it. That way, although you would like your exercise, wouldn't you, to go around? What brings you into this room as a person of faith? Yeah, Sue. The dance of lostness and foundness. Nice, nice. Friends and coworkers who are military personnel. And can you say just one more sentence, like, and so what does that make you? What this body that's a loving body for you and your family has to offer. Nice, nice. Somebody, yeah. Cool. Ah. Nice. I'm going to say that real shorthand, but I hope you heard what she said because it's rich and full. In part, it's, if I heard it right, building on the sense that we'd like to do it differently than we've done it in the past in terms of welcoming home veterans and finding ways to care for one another in the midst of what it means to have served. Is that close? Yeah. Newell? nice. So being a citizen of the United States helps us both respond and gives us a responsibility to respond to the needs of others around us as a community of faith. Yeah, nice. Anything else? Yeah. Nice. Where unrealistic and what kind? Impractical? Hope is a lie. So church becomes a place where hope lives, rests, hopefully springs forth in surprising ways. Let's hope so. Yeah, these are nice. Anything else? Yeah, way in the back. Okay, nice. So it's both the personal side of having a son and wanting to understand and discern how best to be present in the midst of it all, and a professional respondability in the context of clinical work. Nice, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Nice, nice. So it's also, if I hear that as an invitation and a kind of recognition of the limitations of one organization to meet all the world's needs, and the recognition that as a community we can provide more resources for more people with more needs than we could if we were one. Is that kind of close? Okay, thanks. I use the language of call because that's the language I grew up with and the language I still feel in my bones. And I know that oftentimes we think about call as an individual thing. It's between me and God, or me and my church, or me and the seminary. Really, call is about how it is that we are called into the world in this particular place, this particular time, to be the agents of healing in a way that God extends us. So as you think about how you engage and participate in soul repair at your local level, which is part of where this program begins to turn a bit, we've received important and valuable and helpful information to keep thinking. And now as we turn this corner, we begin to say, now what do I do with this? How do I begin to put this into practice? And part of what I hope you keep thinking about is, what is it that grounds you as a community of faith? Whatever community you participate in, how is it that you can help continue to nurture that peace so that it holds on to the healing and the hope and the wisdom in the midst of lots of despair, in the midst of lots of chaos? Because that is the gift of a community of faith in part. I'm also realistic. Disappoint us. Well, I'll be more personal. My church disappoints me sometimes. And in part, I wonder sometimes if part of the woundedness of the soul relates to the fact that persons get disappointed not just in the church and the people who sit in the pews or the pastor, but disappointed in God, or disappointed in God's response in a moment in time, or disappointed in the limitations of reality. Forgiving churches suggests two things. It's a dual kind of role. First of all, I believe that because churches really are human institutions built on a huge foundation of God's grace and love, we're still institutions that sometimes fail. And we need to be forgiven, but more importantly, we need to name sometimes the failures of our communities of faith. Because if we can't name our own failures, or if we're blind to them, or if we're too defended against them lest they hurt us too much, it's hard for people who experience the failure and disappointment of church to come and tell us about it. So it's partly, how is it that we begin to name in our communities of faith places where we've missed the mark, is the way we used to say it, because we don't like to say the word sin too much, as I think Rita pointed out this morning. Or where is it that in our communities of faith we haven't quite seen what we need to see because for whatever reason it is too painful to see, it is too hard to see? I want to name just a couple of places where I think as a community of faith we sometimes fail, recognizing that I can't name them all, but you have some of them in your hearts and wisdom. And then we'll turn at the end here to think about what does it mean to be a community of forgiveness? What does it mean to be a community of grace, of support, of acceptance, of care? And how do we embody that? But let me say just a word about forgiveness before we go down this road. For a long time, I've been thinking about reflecting upon studying and writing and hearing stories and doing what scholars do sometimes, thinking too much, about what it means to live in a world where forgiveness is not just an option, but is sometimes used like a weapon against one another. As in, you should forgive because it's the right thing to do. Seems like not a good way to kind of approach forgiveness. So as I started thinking about this notion of forgiveness, I began to realize a couple of things. One is that forgiveness is not a one-time event where somebody says, I'm sorry for what I've done, and therefore forgiveness happens. Rarely does it happen that way. But instead, forgiveness is a process. And it's not just a process of saying, I'm sorry for what I've done, or you should be sorry for what you've done. It's a process of mutually engaging in a structure of accountability that helps us to live differently. It's a process of mutually engaging in a structure of accountability that helps us to live differently. Forgiveness in the best of all possible worlds, which is 1% of the time, I realize, requires that somehow there's another relationship beyond my own and God's that helps me move my journey along. It may be that someone sits with me while I struggle with, I don't know how to forgive something like this because I just have no way to begin to even think about it. It may be that somebody hears me when I say I am so ashamed for whatever reason that I don't have the language and the capacity to think about it. It means that there's someone who may be willing just for a moment not to have words to respond, but to have an open heart to hear the vulnerabilities and the woundedness of the soul. And with that invitation comes an invitation to enter into a relationship that ultimately holds us accountable in a new way. Forgiveness is not about a one-way street. I forgive you for something you've done, or they have to forgive me for something I've done. It's about how do we live together recognizing that we continue to hurt each other personally and collectively in ways that we can't even yet name. How do we remain open to the knowledge and the wisdom of what it means to be deeply wounded and loved by God? Because those two things go together. Deeply wounded and loved by God. So it's a process of accountability that ultimately leads us to different ways of being. One can never go back to be something that you were before something happened. And yet you are the same person with a different way of being, walking into a new world. Part of what I think forgiveness does is it allows us to not let our past be the last word on our lives. It gives us a way to build on a past, honestly, with regret, with grief, with recognition of loss, with sadness, with hurt, with despair, and recognize that it's not the last word. That's something the community of faith believes. It is not the last word. And forgiveness gives us the ability and the capacity to think about, how do I want to move into the future in a new way? And how do I gather resources around me to move into the future in a new way? Now, this sounds really simple at some levels, but we all know it's much more complicated. We know it's more complicated, and it's full of all kinds of pitfalls, because forgiveness is never in particularly deep and extraordinary kinds of pain and hurt, like soul hurtness. Forgiveness is never something you just kind of do. It's sometimes something that you stumble through or wander through. And if you're really fortunate, you have someone, maybe even a church community, who helps you wander through the darkness, who helps you figure out where the kind of new ways of being might emerge without giving you senses of judgment, but perhaps glimpses of hope. Forgiveness is not the answer to all of the problems of the world. It's not even the answer to some things related to soul repair. It is instead a window or a lens to begin to think about some aspects of what it is we're talking about that might be helped by such things as honesty, confession, changing, turning around, hopefulness, new directions, new behaviors. So forgiveness is not a panacea. It's not a great big cover for everything. It's just a lens to begin to think about some pieces of the journey that might be helped by the recognition of God's continuing steadfast love and grace, and by the community that surrounds us. I sometimes say to my classes in pastoral care, the question, what's the good news about rock bottom? Is, you've heard it. Thank you. This was a simple one. There's nowhere to go but up. Well, you know what the really good news about rock bottom is? There's a rock. Right? And if you're fortunate enough, that rock is big enough to let others sit with you. Or the rock is big enough for you to crawl down for a while to sit with someone else. And I want to keep inviting you to not be afraid of that rock bottom in somebody else's life, but to think about how you might join one another as a community of faith in a rock that lets people sit there for a while to gather strength and courage and kind of sort things through and not push people too fast to the other side, but really sit and be. That's something the community of faith can offer. It doesn't always happen in a fast-paced worship service, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it happens in the listening of a story, or the hearing of a song, or the remembrance of the power of communion. When we sit with one another in the rock bottom. So as you think about what it is that churches might name for ourselves, or might rethink, reconsider, if you will, how have we failed? How have we not been present? I think about a couple things right off the top of my head, and then I'm going to invite you to say a few things. I think sometimes we forget that there's a rock, and we turn away from stories that are painful because we don't really trust that we can hear them fully. I think sometimes the church is quick to pass judgment on how people ought to re-enter the world, or what families ought to do in response to chaos. I think sometimes we're too quick on bringing answers to questions that really don't have very good answers, but are just really good questions. In what ways do you think sometimes the church fails? Thinking that we can do a better job than somebody else, you mean? Not trusting resources around us, not building bridges? Not trusting what's out there. Nice. Nice. Forgetting that we're about relationships. Instead of or in addition to programs, perhaps, that the best programs are really about relationships, is part of what you're saying, right? Yeah, nice. Yeah, nice. We lose our way in defining success. Can you say just another sentence? Nice. Anything else that you can think of just now? We may unwittingly get in the way of God. Nice. Somebody else had their hand up, yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head with churches being judgmental. So because I have seen churches that, how should I put it, people don't wear the right clothes. If you're in the church, that's good enough for me.
Okay. So sometimes we're judgmental about what we see or don't see, or how people ought to live or be, or how people ought to recover or restore. Nice. Yeah. Okay. Anything? Yeah, Michael?
We see the divine in our sanctuary and in our rituals and in each other that we know, but we don't. Sometimes we refuse to see the divine elsewhere.
Okay, we don't always see the divine in places that we don't know or that are unfamiliar. So a couple more in them.
I'm not sure we see our culpabilities.
Nice. That we don't always see our culpabilities, our limitations, nice. Yeah.
Sometimes we don't offer the help until there's a memorial or Veterans Day, and that's when we bring it up.
Very nice. Yeah. I'm going to say this in a different way and tell me if this isn't what you meant. Sometimes we wait for others to bring it up, or for that one day a year that we're supposed to do it. and we are not proactive in saying to people, grace extends, let me hear, or whatever it is, right? Nice. I think one of the things, one more, yes.
I was just going to add on to that, very often, particularly with regard to return of veterans, is the attempt to be welcoming, but really just being superficial and giving pious platitudes without really even knowing what this person is.
Nice. That is so well said. I'm going to try and repeat it so that people can hear it, but I know I'll miss it. The church sometimes is quick to give pious platitudes without really knowing that they don't know what they don't know. We don't. I know I missed some pieces of it. It is one of the dangers of pastoral care, is it not? We have this sense that when somebody says something to us, we're supposed to say something back. Instead of saying, wow. Do you want to say more about that? And we tend to jump in with quick things like, God's on your side, or God will see you through. Well, we are God's body at this moment, and we will see each other through. Yeah, nice. The flip side of this is, how do we become communities of grace, acceptance, reverence, soul repair? And that indeed is part of what I think the workshops and tomorrow's conversations will lead us toward. But I'm going to just give you a couple of pieces that I want to name, and then I want to invite you to say a few more things. It strikes me, I'm going to pick up, Michael, on something you said, I hope not out of context. You talked about the counter-narrative. And it strikes me that one of the ways in which churches can become part of the grace of God in the world is by continuing to lift up the counter-narratives that the world around us sometimes offers to us. Counter-narratives to things like success, or things like what it means to be whole or holy. Because the real narrative underneath that is that there's a particular way that we're supposed to do this. When what we really know is that there are as many journeys of ways to do something as there are people on earth. And that there is not a one-size-fits-all in the journey to wholeness. So one of the ways in which the church can be a place of hopefulness in the midst of fairly despairing times is to continue to lift up counter-narratives to the culture around us. To continue to lift up alternative voices to the one way of doing something, or the one way of healing, or the one way of restoration. To continue to lift up alternate languages to talk about things such as, I think the language of soul repair becomes one of those rich languages of the woundedness of the soul that doesn't displace or take away the psychiatric language that we have, or the DSM-4, 5, 6, whichever one we're on now, but it adds another depth. And that indeed part of the gift is that we can talk about the soul in a meaningful way because we know something about it. So I want to encourage you as people of faith and as part of a community that your congregation take leadership by continuing to offer alternative voices to the stories that oftentimes permeate the culture. The second thing is that we need to continue to live into the invitation of a God whose love extends beyond our human capacity to understand. Every now and then I read neuroscience because it's just interesting to me. And what I know is that I don't get it. I know there's something there. I know they're studying things that I can't even begin to imagine. I know that they're talking about really important, valuable, valid things. And I don't have to understand it all in order to care about the families that sit in the pews next to me. Sometimes we assume that we can't care about someone unless we know their experience or have experienced it ourselves. I don't think that's true. I think we care by the way that we listen to the stories around us, the narratives, the ways that people continue to make sense of their lives. We don't have to understand it all in order to care. So I want to encourage the church, the community, the synagogue, to keep understanding, to keep learning, to keep coming to workshops like this, and then to recognize that in the mystery of God's love, we can care about people without actually understanding every little piece. And it's okay to say, I don't quite understand all that you're telling me, but I experience the power of your story, the power of your narrative. So keep finding ways for your community of faith to be a leader in care, to be a leader in the community in extraordinary care. The third thing is that it strikes me that church, the communities around us, can continue to be spiritual companions with one another across the divides, across the differences we have. To be a spiritual companion does not mean I have to agree with everything you say, although I'd like it better if you agreed with me. It means there is something about the Spirit of God that is bigger than either of our theologies or ideologies. And if we can continue to find ways to move beyond, not to cover them up, but to genuinely value the differences among us, I think we have a stronger chance of being leaders in communities and gathering together in ways that actually change and transform the communities in which we live. The fourth thing is resource. Not every church needs to have every resource. But together in a community, there are multiple resources. So when we get beyond the walls of our own congregation and realize that there's Samaritan counseling centers, there's agape counseling centers, there's veterans groups, there's tons of resources. They may not all be the ones that we need in that moment, which then means we get to create some more. But finding those resources and nurturing them in our communities is part of what I think the church is called to do. It's the mission of the church in part. That we are called not just to serve those of us who sit here, but to serve the community in the world. So continue to discover the resources that are already here and discern how to build on one another's strengths, because we don't all do the same thing, and we each do it a little bit differently. I'm curious what other ways you think of that you might be the church or the congregation that's a leader in your community.
Not being a church that judges, not being a church that gets the reputation, but don't go there and address just so.
Okay, by being a church that's open and not judging. Yeah. Yeah.
If one is a peace and justice church, that's not an excuse to turn a blind eye to the woundedness of those around us.
Nice. Nice. Peace and justice includes caring about the woundedness around us. This is, I think Ron and I were talking about this a little bit. It used to be that you had to choose between social justice and pastoral care. They are connected. It is the way in which we embody the living God in the world. So, yeah, nice. Other things? Yeah.
Say, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty to him. They'll just write a check.
Don't just sometimes write a check. But in addition to writing a check, Nice.
after the homeless, give out meals.
This reminds me of Captain Fauntleroy last night. Just do it. Be and hold. Yeah, nice. We are called to be together as a community of faith, a larger community of faith, not just individual churches, to respond to the woundedness of the world around us. And may the knowledge and grace of a living God sink from our heads down into our hearts so that it flows out of our hands and our mouth and our ears and our eyes, so that this body, this body right here, is the body of Christ in the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.